So, with me, I have one of my personal favorite resources of data, James Nuzzo. We're going to talk a little bit about men's health and the disparity in funding, amongst other things. Well, I mean, I must be honest, a lot of people love the work I do on men's health, but I can only take a small amount of credit for it because I'm often just reformulating your graphics. So I'd just love to know, what is the gendered health gap? It's something I hear so much about. I always hear women's health is underfunded. What have you found?
I end up combating the common narrative in the media and politics, and usually it's framed as women's health is underfunded, women are understudied. So you'll see that regularly in The Guardian and New York Times and stuff. But that is not at all true. Um, Maybe there can be small areas, particular health outcomes, or particular types of research where women are less represented as participants. But in general, as I've shown, women's health gets more funding than men's health. And it gets quite a bit more funding. And it's not just in one place. So we've got the data from Australia, we've got the data from the US. There's differences in terms of how many offices there are within government agencies.
So those are the federal offices of research for women's health.
So in the US, the main one is the Office for Research on Women's Health, and it falls within the National Institutes of Health. But then there's all these other offices. There's a small office in the Food and Drug Administration. Within the Department of Justice, they have their own women's office. And so that'll be very focused on, the gender-based violence. There's a women's bureau within the Department of Labor in the U.S., and then you have state-level offices as well. Out of the 50 states in the U.S., I think 43 of them have a state office or state commission for girls and women, and 0 of them have one for boys and men.
I guess that's very antithetical to what we're often told, something I've learned thanks to yourself and others like you. So there are several different federal offices for women's health research, tax funded in America, and various other sort of offices outside of health. But how much money are we talking here? How much money is going into women's health that isn't going into men's health in America?
80% of the NIH research budget is not sex-specific. Of the 20% that is sex-specific, about 15% goes to women's health, and about 5% goes towards men's health. So you might say, okay, well, shouldn't it be like 10 and 10? But what makes it even worse is that, of course, you have the big life expectancy difference in the US. So if anything, if you were going to make it disproportionate, you might have a good argument for making it disproportionate in favor of men, because they, in the US, die about 5 years earlier than women. You have the same thing happen in Australia. The main governing body is the NHMRC. They're the ones that fund medical research in Australia. And the differences there are even greater. So I think each year men's health gets about $10 million, and then women's health gets about $100 million.
Wow.
I don't even think the women's health data includes maternal health research. They have that listed as a separate category, which I think is also like $50 million a year. So, and of course, you have a similar life expectancy difference in Australia as well.
Preaching to the choir in many ways, James. I mean, I understand how poorly men's health is doing, because often you point to these disparities in health funding in America, for example, when people will assume that men's health is doing really well and doesn't need as much funding, but it's actually the opposite is true. I know that in the top 15 causes of death in America, men lead in 13 of them. I know they die at about a rate 1.5 times higher. They live less life, not just in America, as you pointed out, but in quite literally every country in the world. And now, just to be male, the male sex is the single biggest demographic predictor of early death. So it's really, really bad. Often when I have these conversations, which is all the time, someone will come in with historical context and they'll point to something like, it's a catching up exercise, or it's a pendulum's being swung, or it's reverse sexism. So when has women's health been underfunded? How far back have you looked? When is it where men were advantaged? And to what extent is this a catching up exercise?
Well, I have data from the NIH going back to 1988. And even then, it was the same funding difference. And that was even before the creation of the Office of Research on Women's Health. So the whole justification for the creation of that office in the early 1990s was the claim that women were underrepresented as research participants and underfunded and so on and so forth. That claim was actually never really true. So they ended up passing the legislation that created the office. And then there was a nonpartisan group called the Institute of Medicine, I believe they are called. And they did a big report on women's health a couple years after that office was created. And they found that there were certain circumstances where women were underrepresented in trials, but then there were ones where they were overrepresented. And then there were some where it was a 50-50 split. And they basically said, yeah, there's not really good evidence for this. And ever since, that narrative has continued, and it's not been
Mm.
true almost the entire time. There are certain types of studies, early phase drug trials, in which women are less represented. There were some reasons for that, which the FDA decided upon. So it was the government that decided that. There were a couple of drugs that were being prescribed to women for
Thalidomide.
other, yeah, for other uh,
Mm.
causes,
Morning
but
sickness.
yeah, yes, and the babies had birth defects, and so they said, okay, women of childbearing age, we're going to exclude from early phase trials. And by the way, that is a protective mechanism. That is meant to help women. So
Mm.
basically, the way things are framed now is that you can never do anything correct in terms of the feminist viewpoint. So had women been more often participants in early research, which was a little bit more risky, feminists would be complaining today about, oh, the female body was used and abused through experimentation, right? And then when they turn out to be underrepresented, they'll say, oh, you've never cared about women's health. So it's kind of, you can just never win sometimes.
It's a bit like a guinea pig, isn't it? Like in those early phases, because I do know a little bit what you're talking about, probably because I've read your research, but it was specifically women of childbearing potential excluded from the first two phases of drug testing, not the third phase, which is the safer. It was the risky two. And they were
Yeah.
excluded because they didn't want to use untested drugs after the thalidomide scandal, which was horrendous. And it was actually intended as an act to protect women. To be used as a guinea pig, that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. We use guinea pig quite literally as a metaphor for someone or something that's being exploited. So you can't win. If we were like, okay, all early drug testing is going to be used on women, then it would be, we're not your guinea pigs. And it's like, okay, we'll take you out of it. And they're like, we've been excluded from medical trials. It's like, you got, like, which one, you can't possibly win. But now obviously it's
That's
changed. I think 1993, they were like, bring them back in.
yes.
Generally speaking, it's not like that anymore.
And another unfortunate thing about that whole narrative is that a lot of men were participants in early research, and I've written about this. I've written a piece called Men, the Martyrs of Medicine. And men were oftentimes putting themselves at risk, kind of
Mm.
experimenting on themselves, and maybe men in the military as well. And when we don't recognize that history for what it was, we're also not appreciating things that men have done for society at the same time.
One of the areas where women were excluded was, I think it was heart disease. And the reason they're excluded is because they get heart disease so late in their lives. They were too old to be included in medical trials, whereas men get it earlier and die earlier as a result. They were able to enter. So it wasn't necessarily because they're women; it's because they got it so later in life, which again is in many ways like an advantage.
Yeah, and you would think, just based off of that kind of mortality information, that
Mm.
yeah, you would want to help the group of people that's more at risk earlier on in life. And if that happens to be the men, that happens to be the men. If it happens to be the women, it happens to be the women. But that nuance that you just provided there, that historical nuance, is just never presented in articles in the Guardian or anything.
It's just not good for tweeting, is it? If I were to tweet out women are excluded from medical trials, that's going to go viral. If I say women of childbearing potential were excluded from phase 1 and phase 2 of medical trials to protect them from untested, it's a boring. I'm bored of
That's right.
that. So I guess to conclude, women's funding for women's health vastly outnumbers men's health, although the majority of funding is non-gendered. Going back, that goes as far back as 1988, arguably beyond that, although they were excluded from medical trials, but that was often for good intentions. So it's not
Yes.
quite as simple as the catchphrase.
That is correct. Yep. You will read the same exact narratives in the media in Australia as you do in England, as you do in the United States. Yeah, it's really hard to know what to do to combat that. I publish the data, I publish the graphs, hoping to convince people. I mean, the data that I take are literally from the government's website. They have a table that shows it from however many years those data have been presented. Apparently, has not been of any concern to anyone that the box representing women each year says $100 million and the box that says men says 10 million. I mean, at least make it a little bit closer. I mean, it's a huge relative difference.
Well, I mean, I guess that I'd love to know, how does it go down in dinner parties, etc., when you bring these facts up?
Oh gosh. Well, at dinner parties, I try to stay away from things like politics and religion. But to be honest, I think most people kind of you appreciate the different things that I'll be posting about. They'll usually follow me on social media or something, and they seem to get it. They admit a lot of female advantage in different areas, and for them, it's oh yeah, that's not really all that surprising, to be honest. And
I get that all the time. Oh, that's so interesting. And I'm like, okay, yeah, it is interesting, but can't you just be a little bit annoyed or outraged or do like, oh, that's interesting. I'm like, that's not enough. Like, you should be pissed off, like,
yeah.
because you've been lied to in many ways. Like, we've been misled, and it's caused untold amounts of death. Why do you think we are so ignorant to this? Why do we refuse to believe it? Not only not believe it, but insist on the opposite being true.
Well, I guess there'd be certain people that have special interests in keeping the narrative alive. Like if you're a non-for-profit group that represents women's health or something in some way, or the gender-based violence sector, or if you're an academic that writes papers in that space, or you'll be seeking grant funding, it helps to keep your narrative alive. So you have that. I think we all humans probably have a particular cognitive bias toward viewing females as being victims more often than we view men, and I think maybe we're just working against our own biology in a way. But yeah, we've got to keep putting the information out there and see if we can get a more kind of objective look at things.
One of the another retort I hear, people talk specifically about reproductive health. And although I'm never going to argue against more funding for women's reproductive health, I do get frustrated when people suggest that women's reproductive health gets more money than men's reproductive health. Because my next question is, what do you even call a male reproductive specialist? Because we have a gynecologist, and they never know what an andrologist does, because that's what a male reproductive specialist is.
I can tell you, when you go into biomedical research databases and you keyword search certain words like this, like if you just keyword search the phrase men's health versus the phrase women's health, you get so many more hits for phrases like women's health, anything that has to do with women, than you do men's health. And that just goes to show that we haven't conceptualized or abstracted men's health to be a thing. So we might focus on particular issues that relate to men a lot, like let's say alcohol abuse, but we don't take that further step up and say men's health issue. And I think that really needs to be a thing that happens to catch on, because then you use that, just like the women's health advocates have mastered for decades now. You just use that phrase and boom, you get a bunch of money sent your way.
I mean, I can often boil it down to just the catchphrase, squeaky wheel gets the oil. And that's not a criticism at women. Like, I think they've done an excellent job in advocating for women's health, but because they do talk about it so much and they do push for it and they don't accept no for an answer, they get more funding. Whereas men, we know men are less likely to disclose issues or talk about things. They're quite quiet. That the secondary impact of that is a lack of funding or interest or empathy. So it is a lot of it's down to just a lack of advocacy on behalf of men, I think, as well. I'd love to know as well, like, the philosophy of health. Like, how should we talk about health? Because I assume the way we talk about health is more female-centric or gynocentric. Like, do men engage with health like less often? Because I know obviously there's more apprehension on men seeking healthcare, like going to the doctors. How could we change the way that strategically we present healthcare to get more men to engage with it, not just about giving it more money?
So I know in some of the survey research where they've asked about this, they ask about men's like preferences for doctors. They basically just want the doctor to be competent, to be well credentialed, to have a bit of banter, like to be able to joke a little bit, have good sense of humor. Anything that gets rid of like excessive paperwork and bureaucracy, I would think would be very male friendly. I know be very friendly to me, but because that funding is missing right now, we can't run the surveys. If you wanted to, you could do a massive survey that would not take much effort and just ask men around the world or a specific country and ask them their list of preferences for what would get them more likely to see the doctor.
This is the sort of question what's a wall I always run into during podcasts, where often we're just talking speculatively because we don't know because no one's asking. And that the whole problem about not having an office for men's health or not having adequate funding is that we don't get to run these surveys. We don't actually get to find out. So it's left to just people like you and I just to speculate. But
Mm.
you gave the right advice there. Where number one, square one, ask men. Like, I do a huge survey asking men, why don't you seek help from healthcare professionals? And then from there, that will inform the next step. But we're just grasping at straws about that.
Another one I'll add, George, just real quick, is most surveys will show that health literacy is lower among men than women.
Hmm.
So men are less likely to be aware of certain like health guidelines, like, I don't know, physical fitness guidelines or something like that. I think what happens is after, I don't know, after high school, they start to drop out of the healthcare system. They're no longer under the guidance of their parents. So, how you can keep men kind of engaged during that period where they would start to drop off, I think that could be, yeah, a key thing to look into.
Guess moving on. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of what you might call narrative violations within this conversation, where people might be hearing things that they're not used to hearing, and often go diametrically opposite to what they thought was true. I suppose the big one is the idea of we living in a patriarchy. By that, I mean it goes by various definitions, but the idea that men are systemically advantaged over women, structurally speaking, it's powerful men passing down the baton of privilege down to all men. But what I've heard, particularly in health, men's health is doing really poorly, behind women's by almost every metric, and yet they're not getting the funding or the research, and the opposite for women, where their health is doing better but by no means perfect, and then they're getting the funding and they're getting the research. So how can you reconcile that within this idea of us living in a patriarchy, specifically in the West?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we are living in a patriarchy. I think I might have to just kind of reject the idea to begin with. You know, I guess for those that think that that theory is correct, have you looked for things that might contradict that theory? So, for
Mm.
example, women now make up about 60% of university graduates. I mean, having a university degree is quite a powerful thing and can get you places. Women make up the vast majority of the individuals that get to shape and mold the minds of young people. That's quite powerful. They're most of the primary school educators. They'll receive the majority of government subsidies in one way or another, which oftentimes comes through men paying more of the tax burden for society. So they get that privilege as well. They have the privilege of getting more of the funding of the research money. There's equal opportunity that's written into law in Western countries.
I mean, I was trying to antagonize you a little bit of that question, but although there are certainly many ways in which women are struggling, there are also many ways in which men are struggling. And a more accurate picture to paint of society is one of very complicated privilege and disadvantage, depending on who you are, where you live, and what sex you belong to. It blows my mind how we could say we live in a patriarchy when men are behind in so many areas, but also how we ignore those areas. If we live in a patriarchy, there'd be 10 offices for men's health and none for women. There'd be $100 million for men's health and 10 million for women, but the opposite is actually true.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know, try your best to understand how someone could buy so squarely into this idea of systemic male advantage when everything you told me points to that not being true, and in many ways the opposite being true?
Well, I would say that most individuals would not be aware of the data that we're talking about, the data on the differences in higher education and all that. And then a lot of the professors they have, to the extent they might actually know some of that information, they don't really share it very openly. Um, I do think the narrative is changing a little bit. And I kind of was saying this a couple years ago. The men's health epidemiological data is so strong, but in a bad way in terms of male suicide, drug-induced deaths, alcohol-induced deaths, the life expectancy difference, work fatalities, drownings. If you actually take time to look at the epidemiological data, it's
Mm.
just standing out. And so I don't think you can continue to ignore that too much longer when you have people like yourself and me continually getting this content out there. But the group of people that go on with that narrative, they're gonna change a little bit. They're gonna mold and try something a little bit different, I think.
I mean, I agree. It is starting to turn. Although I must say, Australia seems to. I've seen some wacky things coming out from Australian academia and especially newspapers. It's just education and health were often yardsticks for asserting that we lived in a patriarchy in the past. And now women are ahead at all areas of education, at least in the West, and in all areas of health. And yet we still bang in the drum of the patriarchy. And it's like, well, when is it smashed? Is it not smashed yet? Like, surely it's smashed. We seem to not know. It's not that we're denying the truth. It's that most of people just do not know the truth. And the truth is that education, boys are behind every stage, every Western country, and health, men are behind in more or less every single
And
metric.
and I think you could. It would be interesting to test some of this. So if you administered a survey to a group of people and asked, what is the size of the life expectancy difference?
Mm.
And people were able to put any number that they wanted to. I would be really interested to see what that is because, to be honest with you, prior to a few years ago, I didn't really think anything about a sex difference in life expectancy. It was
Mm.
just never anything that I thought about. So you could ask people about that. You could ask people about, what percentage of completed suicides are male, what percentage of occupational fatalities are male, and just see what numbers they put down. And it might be quite revealing. Some people might just have no clue whatsoever.
YouGov did a similar study to that in the UK not long ago, and I think about 90% or more weren't aware that men and boys were behind in education, and certainly not aware of how far behind they are. So, like 9 in 10 people don't even know. So, how could they possibly do something about it if they don't even know the problem exists? So, it does feel like we're in an awareness raising stage, which is hopefully what this
I
conversation is doing.
I agree.
But it doesn't help that large organizations, we talked a lot about government organizations, but there's many like international organizations too. I know you post a lot about the World Economic Forum, who I must admit, to great shame, they're a former client of mine. The Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum is probably the biggest, most influential study of gender equality anywhere in the world. It happens every single year. It's called the GGGR. And it's very misleading in the way it measures the data or presents the data back to you. So the yardstick we've been given is corrupt. It's wrong. It's unfair. It's like a bendy mirror that isn't giving us the true picture. So what can you tell us about the World Economic Forum's gender gap report and how biased it is?
Yeah, well, you said it quite well there. Basically, if boys and men are behind, the index does not recognize that. So it's not really a measure of gender equality at all. It will only indicate when girls and women are behind. It won't indicate when boys and men are behind. It is such a blatant form of discrimination. It's one of the worst. Like how you can possibly do that from just a moral level to design an index like that.
Mm.
And then it has additional issues too, where it assumes the life expectancy difference of a certain size. So it assumes some biological determinism there, and but then it does not assume biological factors in other areas, and that's what David Geary and his colleague who created the the much better, newer index, I can't remember what that one is called.
The Bidgie.
Yeah, and that one's much better. The index can show boys and male disadvantage when it exists, so that's like the key thing. Whereas the WEF focuses on differences in outcomes.
Mhm.
I think Geary, their approach is, well, differences in outcomes, that's a bit misleading because people make different choices in life. And so they focus a little bit more on quantifying opportunity, like educational opportunity and stuff like that. It's a huge, huge correction to a deeply flawed, quote unquote, gender equality index.
I mean, I know that the BIGI, standing for Basic Index of Gender Inequality, I believe, I think it found about 2/3, 1/3 of countries studied, women are behind, 2/3 men are behind. Really breaks down to women, when women were behind, particularly in developing countries, they were further behind than men, but men were still behind, but to a lesser extent in more developed countries, particularly in life expectancy and education. So already a more complex picture, but just want to go over the flaws of the gender gap report by the World Economic Forum, which again, they're pretty much painting the picture globally of what gender equality looks like. And they're presenting headlines like, it's going to take 150 years for women and men to have parity, which is just so manipulative. And I've worked for the World Economic Forum. I've been to Davos. I've documented that. Well, I worked on the Global Gender Gap Report like 10 years ago. And I just want to be really clear on how it's flawed. First of all, it looks at equality of outcome, which everyone knows is flawed. Equality of opportunity is the more preferable. Secondly, it doesn't measure where men and boys are behind. So if women and girls are behind, rightly so, that's seen as not equal. But if men and boys are behind, that's seen as equal. So in every single country in the West where men and boys are behind in education, for example, that's equal. Like, that's literally how it works. It's written in the methodology. It's right there. And then even crazier than that, because as I mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned, that men live less life in every country in the world, every single country, whether developed or developing, that doesn't look good for the WEF, because that means every single country is going to be scored down. So what they say is they put a yardstick, I think it's 5 years, and they say every country, women should live 5 years more than men. So they basically change the measurement, the barometer of equality, where unless a woman is living 5 years longer than a man, that is a disadvantage to her. So in a country where a woman only lives 4 years more than a man, she seems disadvantaged. And this guy who's living 4 years less life, he's advantaged. Like,
It is
what?
absurd.
How could you possibly arrive there? And it's all written in the methodology of the report, black and white. And it's just like, how could they do that every single
And you,
year?
and you were not able to to influence them to change it? Were you
No,
working on that?
I was downstream. I'm a creative. So I would work on the animations that would go to Davos. So in Davos, they have a big meeting where a bunch of billionaires meet. They all shake each other's hands and pat each other on the back. Nothing really happens of interest, to be honest, or at least behind the scenes, perhaps it does, but not on camera. And then they'd have big conferences where everyone again pats each other on the back, and they'd show an amazing animation about just how great we're doing and how the World Economic Forum's closing the gender gap. And I would often create those animations. And now
Okay.
I've left. Now I'm walking on the other side, and I've had enough distance where I feel like I have an obligation, in many ways, to undo the damage I've caused. So hopefully I've done that, plus interest. And I just can't believe how badly intended World Economic Forum is, and they must know what they're doing. The fact that they consider a man and boy being behind as equal is outrageous. So one of the facts I think is amazing, couldn't believe it, women are, in Iran, women are 75% of STEM graduates, which is one of the biggest disparities anywhere in the world. That's considered equal somehow. And it's not even just the World Economic Forum. Another organization that I know you and I are constantly shaking our fists at is UNWomen, meaning United Nations Women. So what can you tell us about this lovely organization?
They are an explicitly feminist organization. Intersectional feminism is the philosophy that guides them.
Mm-hmm.
And they rely primarily on taxpayer money from member states. Gosh, what is it? $500 million a year from member states. So they get a lot of money. What do they do with that money? I don't even know. I don't even think it helps girls and women, to be honest. They create new reports every week. They've recently been taking cheap shots at the quote unquote manosphere. Um, they have no empathy for boys and men whatsoever, which is really just strange. I don't understand why you can't just be, if you want to be a girls and women's organization, great, represent their interests. But why do you have to attack men at the same time? It is just crazy, the approach that they take. And so as you know, I've been putting a lot out there about where their funding is coming from. I'm trying to wake people up that this is a taxpayer funded group and they are not worthy of your tax money. And if the UN, if we're going to continue to send money to the UN, can we at least get a separate body that represents the interests of boys and men?
Totally agree. It's just frustrating thing about UNWomen is that they're spending a lot of time criticizing the manosphere, which I've obviously noticed. And the frustrating thing about that is that I think wherever the manosphere is, it's sort of like the end product of people like the UN ignoring these issues that men and boys experience because the West's not talking about it, the UN's not talking about it, governments are rarely talking about it. Someone's going to have to talk about it. So here comes the manosphere, which is sort of metastasized out of this neglect. And instead of actually using that as a chance for the UN women to ask, maybe we could have done better, they're just attacking it. And it's like, this
Yeah.
is a representation of your failure. And instead of using it as a chance to be like, oh, maybe we could have done better, they're like, if anything, you're making it worse. And I don't mind the World Economic Forum doing it so much because that's a private organization. But UN Women, you're paying for that. I'm paying for that. Everyone listening's paying for that through our taxes. And it's not fair.
No, I wish I had more answers for you. It's so tough, man. I don't know what to do. You know, I spend all day just generating new content and but there's just not much support, like financial support out there.
Is that this whole area of advocacy is just built on good intentions and honesty of people such as yourself and hopefully me too, where we've not got the funding. We don't have that $100 million or whatever, billions of dollars that UNWomen get. We're just trying our very best and we're very honest about not having the answers. And it is frustrating how often I hear, I don't know, even from really smart, well-informed people such as yourselves. I mean, I admire you being so honest about it, but it is frustrating because we should know. We should know these things. So the last thing I want to talk about is that it caught me by surprise a little bit about some of your older research. You've done quite a bit of research into circumcision of boys, and it's an interesting area for me because it's one of the most obvious double standards within gender equality, where obviously we have FGM, meaning female genital mutilation, and rightly so, that is illegal in almost all countries now in a universal capacity. There's no level of mutilation. It doesn't matter what you do, none of it's acceptable. It's all illegal. Totally right. But we look the other way and care little at all about when we start mutilating a boy's genitals. So what do you know from your sort of older work in this area?
And it actually stemmed from a kind of a viewer comment of an interview I did a few years back. And the commenter just said, "Hey, have you ever considered male circumcision as a form of gender bias?" And I had never. And I started to think about it a little bit more. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of interesting. So what I did was I collected every study that I could find, survey study, that asked parents of boys who were circumcised why they decided to do it. And then I found every study I could find, survey study, that asked parents of girls why they decided to mutilate their girls. And what you find is that the reasons that parents give for those two situations are not all that different, broadly speaking. And what I mean by that is that most of the reasons relate to religion, tradition, culture, those types, custom, whatever word you want to use to describe that, mostly non medical reasons. So the word mutilation basically has value judgment built into it,
Mm.
but male circumcision is a benign medical term. It does not have value judgment built into it. So basically, the point of my paper was just to show that this is an example of gender bias. Here we have parents deciding on doing these two different things for mostly similar reasons, yet one we view negatively and the other one we just say, shrug our shoulders. Yeah, sure. We'll just let it keep going on.
So why do you think that is? Because that's the exact double standards that I noticed. Is that how could we look the other way when it comes to violating, especially a baby's bodily integrity for boys, and then for girls we care deeply? Why is it such a cognitive dissonance in your view?
Yeah, well, I think it relates to some of the cognitive bias we were referring to earlier, gamma bias, that type of thing, where we just, for whatever reason, maybe have inbuilt more empathy for girls and women when it comes to things related to violence, and we have less so for boys and men, and we just view them as more disposable. We can use them as guinea pigs in
Mm.
experiments. We can cut off bits of their penis and just say, "Yeah, that's how it is."
And then on top of that, you've got a layer of sort of rhetoric that is stopping that realization from happening, that the idea of male disposability is an offensive thing to many people, that is antithetical to what they believe. And we're told that women are the disposable gender. They're the ones we don't care about. Men are the privileged gender. What are you talking
Mhm.
about? So it's getting over that roadblock so we can actually see the reality of the landscape, and then trying to do some of the important work you mentioned. Often when we talk about circumcision, is people always compare it to FGM. Is it the same? Is it not the same? And I only find a limited amount of utility to that conversation because it's so complicated. There are so many different types of both. Some forms of FGM are barbaric and amongst the worst things you could possibly do to someone, and they are worse than circumcision. But then some forms of circumcision on boys are horrendous too, and they're worse than some types of FGM. Like, in the UK, the NHS considers a woman who consensually has a labia pierced to be a victim of FGM. But then a boy in the Philippines who has his foreskin wrapped around a wooden stump and then slashed off by a male tribesman with like a rusty razor, that's circumcision. That's clearly worse than the NHS version. So in that instance, the circumcision's worse. The talk of circumcision revolves so much around America, and rightly so, because it's so awful there. But how bad is it around the world? And what are some of the more extreme versions that we just do not hear spoken about?
So I think in the US, maybe it's something like 80%
Mm.
of the male population is circumcised, and then maybe worldwide, maybe 40%. Does that
Mm.
sound about right?
I think in America it's 80% of all men, and I think it's about 65% of male babies. So there's that, obviously it happens in two phases. I think about 60% of male babies are circumcised in America, which is horrendous, and then that obviously goes up because some people have it later in life,
Yeah.
roughly speaking.
And then in Muslim countries, the data look like 95%, something like that. And as you mentioned, in some of these countries, we use the word male circumcision, like I was saying, benign medical term, but there's studies showing that they're not being done by doctors, they're not being done in sterile environments, and there can be adverse side effects to it. Interestingly, about the time I was writing up that paper that I published, there was a case here in Perth, Australia, where two boys from the same family had the procedure done. I think by the same doctor on the same day, and both had significant issues. The one boy died, and the other boy was in critical condition. I believe he ultimately survived. But when you look at all these so-called benefits, I mean, they can be resolved through other things. Every once in a while, you'll see claims maybe of reduces the chance of penile cancer or something, when the number of people that actually acquire that condition is very, very minimal. Maybe reduced urinary tract infections is mentioned sometimes, but I think that's just can be treated by an antibiotic rather than getting part of your penis chopped off. So yeah, the rationale for the benefit, I just don't really see it.
There's a study by Cambridge University. I think they studied about 10,000 men in Africa, and they found that HIV rates between circumcised men and non-circumcised men is more or less the same. So there was no evidence at all that it reduces HIV in that case. I think UTIs, I think you have to perform 100 circumcisions to prevent one UTI. And it's like, oh, that's not proportionate. And that's just not something we do to other parts of the body. We don't treat athlete's foot by just cutting your feet off. We don't treat glaucoma by pulling out your eyes, or dandruff by cutting off your head. Like, we seem to think it's fine, some sort of prevention to just cut off parts of a boy's penis to supposedly prevent these medical things. So it's just, again, I guess the running theme of this conversation is just double standards. And I just cannot, I'm going to ask you again, how can you get inside the head of someone that can justify these things towards a boy and understand how they're thinking these things and why they choose to do this to their child?
Well, interesting thing about the surveys that I looked through is that I think sometimes the parents don't really know what they're doing. So
Mm,
they're just kind of going along with kind of the inertia of society or the doctor's office or something. And there's some, the very, very few number, but some parents who responded in the survey that they said they literally did not know why they decided. They're just kind of, well, uh, well, actually, this is actually a main reason that the father had it done. Well,
mm,
the father had it done, and so I want, the boy to look like his father, or his brothers had it done, and so yeah, we're just gonna have him look like his brothers, or all the other boys in the neighborhood have had it done, and so I I want him to look like the other boys, and I don't want him to get picked on or something like that. And so those are some of the reasons that um, parents gave. They weren't giving medical reasons. I mean, they gave some medical reasons, but there were things very general like hygiene.
mm.
But hygiene, I mean, you just need a bar of soap, right? So
Yeah, so it's not an excuse for just talk to your children about hygiene. That's it. That's the solution. Not cut bits of their body off. Again, it's just that you would not do that anywhere else. I get dirt under my fingernails sometimes. I don't pull my fingernails off to solve that problem, and it's the same here. I mean, I spoke to a guy called Eric Klopper a few days ago. Actually, he's a Jewish lawyer in America, and he is currently suing the state of Oregon for violation of human rights and a violation of the right to equal protection in America on the basis of circumcision. And once he's done with Oregon, I think he's going to Illinois, and then he's planning on suing every single state one by one
yeah.
to basically stop it from happening, to go right upstream. So it doesn't matter about what the parents say; it's just going to be outlawed. And that is progress, and that is the way you do it. I think you go to the top, because a lot of parents don't know what they're doing. They don't know. Like, they were circumcised, so why not circumcise their son?
It's an
Mm,
interesting time, I think, to have the conversation around circumcision because of all the talk about the transgender stuff and the gender affirming care and all these
mm,
things. So I think it's actually a pretty good time
mm.
to start to have that conversation because I think it's going to create for some people, oh, wait a minute, I was sort of against this thing over here, but yet I'm still allowing this thing over here. How can I make sense of that? So I think it's a good time to
Yeah,
bring up the
it's
circumcision.
another double standard, particularly on the right. I know people. Ben Shapiro is just one name, one of many. He's obviously one of the biggest critics of gender affirming sort of care on children. Understandable, and I join in there. But then he'll himself he'll advocate for his own sort of genital surgeries on children for his own ideological reasons, and this is again double standard that quite uncomfortable for them to be pointed out. Anyway, James, I'm going to start wrapping up, but I'd just love to know a little bit about putting down the researcher academic hat and just love to know, what is it like as an individual to be in this snake pit of politically unpopular conversation? Like, how have you found yourself here doing this thing? Because it's not where you started. Like, you're obviously in sports science, but now you're here. What's that
Yeah.
journey been like, and how do you feel about it?
I have effectively been canceled from the university that I was at. So it has come at a consequence to me. However, I will say there is so much more demand for this stuff on men's health than I ever received in doing like pure exercise science or neurophysiology. There's so much more consumer demand, so much more interest. I get many more emails, messages, thanks for the work you're doing, all that stuff. And I didn't get very, very little of that when I was doing purely exercise stuff. So I think there's some momentum growing. People like yourself are helping create that momentum in the men's health space. It's kind of I think, an exciting time, but it's also a bit weird. We don't really know where it's going, but we feel like we're making progress or gaining traction, maybe a little?
I think so. I mean, some of the policies I was laughed at 5 years ago that I was pushing, like a strategy for men's health, minister for men, they've all been discussed now. They've been discussed in Parliament. In fact, the Violence Against Men and Boys bill that I've been talking about for many years, that's being proposed. And it's like it's all becoming real. And I mentioned earlier the men's health strategy. In the UK, we have a women's health strategy, rightly so, but now we have a men's health strategy. That's only within the last 6 months or so that's happened. So that's a massive, massive win. That's hopefully going to put some of the money into men's health and the research that we've been talking about. And so hopefully that will arrive in Australia, America, and the rest of the world soon. But I mean, in the short time I've been here, I've noticed real change. So I'd love to know what's next for James Nuzzo. What do you see the next few years like in your life?
Ooh, that's a good question because I don't even know what the next week holds at this point. It's a very tricky situation at the moment, but right now I'm focused on my Substack page, which is the Nuzzo letter. I'm just going to continue to put out the data, put out those graphs, and then put out my commentary along with that, and continue to publish some scientific papers. The info on Substack, I'm planning to continue to try to ramp that up, and then see what opportunities come my way as a result of that.
Your Substack is incredible. I'm a subscriber and I recommend everyone else subscribe to it too. The work you put out is just objective truth. Like, you're not spinning it. Like you said, you're just taking the graphs on government websites and presenting them. And I understand they're different to what we're used to seeing, but that's not your fault. Like, you're just holding up a mirror, a flat mirror. And the mirror you previously been looking at has been one of these crazy sort of wall of mirrors, and like here, they don't line up. So you should be annoyed at the distorting mirror, not what you're presenting. What you're presenting is just objective truth. So sad, but not surprising to hear that you've had a bit of backlash. Just to go over it again, I'd love to know, where can we read more of your work? Tell us a bit about Substack. How do we find it? How do we support you some more?
Yep. So the name of the Substack is the Nuzzo letter. I'm also quite active on X as well, and my handle is just my name, James L. Nuzzo. Those are my two main sources for distributing info. Any of my academic papers that have been published open access, I do have those indexed as well. So be happy to have people come along and follow and subscribe to my Substack.
Excellent. And I highly recommend it. It's a really, really great Substack. Thank you, James.
Thank you.